Trample. It's been a keyword since Magic was born in 1993. It allows a creature to deal excess combat damage to the player it's attacking, even if the creature is blocked. In other words, it's a form of evasion that makes chump blocking almost meaningless. This keyword is certainly powerful when it's on the right card, and there have been many powerful cards with Trample over the years. If you're interested in seeing just how powerful, you can check out my MTG Top 10 on the subject. However, that doesn't mean that having Trample automatically makes a card powerful, as this list can attest. In this video, I'll give my picks for the 10 worst Trample cards in Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. To make it on one of my worst lists, the following things have to be true. It has to be bad in 60 card constructed, 40 card limited, and commander. It also has to have always been bad. If a card is bad today but it was good in its original context, it can't be included here. In short, a card has to be bad everywhere and for all of its history, or it can't be on the list. Alright, let's dive in with my picks for the 10 worst cards that have or grant Trample. At number 10, I've got Ebony Rhino. For 7 generic mana, it's a 4/5 artifact creature with Trample. Obviously enough, that's a terrible stat line, and it even was in Magic's earliest days. It's just not an imposing enough creature for 7 mana, but as bad as it is, it's by far the best card on this list. Everything else on the list is even more inefficient for what it gives you. I actually spent some time debating what would take this number 10 slot, and for a time I was considering putting Tika's Dragon here, but in the end I decided the Dragon was slightly better. Sure, it doesn't give you anywhere near 9 mana worth of value, but I think spending 9 on a 5/5 with Flying Trample and Rampage 4 is better than spending 7 mana on a 4/5 Trampler. At number 9, it's Igneous Golem. Like Ebony Rhino, it's super inefficient. It's a 5 mana 3/4, but unlike the Rhino, it doesn't come packing Trample permanently. You have to spend 2 generic if you want to ever give it the keyword, and it only lasts until end of turn. So if you spend 7 mana total on Igneous Golem, what you get is a 3/4 Trampler, and then after that you have to spend 2 mana every other time you want it to gain Trample too, and I think that's even worse than Ebony Rhino. At number 8, it's Goblin Rock Sled. By far the most efficient creature on the list, it's 1 generic and a red for a 3/1 with Trample. If we start right there, we have an adequate card. But obviously, since it's on this list, things don't end there. It has 2 other abilities that are entirely massive downsides. First, it can't attack unless your opponent controls a mountain, and it doesn't untap during your untap step if it attacked during your last turn. So even in an ideal situation, where your opponent has the mountain, it can only attack every other turn. And frequently your opponent just won't have a mountain. And those downsides take it from adequate to absolutely terrible. However, it is tough to put too high on the list because of its relative efficiency. While it's hard to take advantage of that as an attacker, it does still block reasonably well for a 2-drop, and that's something. I mean, it's still one of the worst cards with Trample ever, but at least there are 7 cards that are even worse. At number 7, it's Centaur Veteran. For 5 generic and a green, it's a 3/3 Trampler. Yeah, that's a rough stat line. It makes Ebony Rhino look like Ragavan. By the time you cast this, it's not going to be trampling over anything, because your opponent is going to have way bigger creatures than a 3/3. So, with that bad of a stat line, a card really needs to have a powerful ability to overcome it, and of course Centaur Veteran doesn't get there. You can pay a green and discard a card to regenerate it, and that does mean that the Veteran can block and attack forever, and as long as you have mana and a card in hand, it's pretty hard for it to die, but giving up a card to regenerate it is a very real cost. You're better off just, playing the cards you draw than using them to regenerate this abysmal creature. And while the discard effect does give it some synergy points with mechanics like Madness, it takes way, way, way too long to get this down for that to ever matter. At number 6, it's Lunk Errant. For 5 generic and a red, it's a 4/4, so another very inefficient creature, and this one doesn't even always have Trample. When it attacks alone, it gets +1/+1 and gains Trample until end of turn. That's way too restrictive. I mean, if this was a 6 mana 5/5 that always had Trample, it would be a bad card. And if it was a 6 mana 4/4 that only gained +1/+1 and Trample when it attacked, it would also be a bad card. But it's worse than both of those because the conditions it asks for to gain the buff are so narrow. If Lunk Errant isn't attacking alone, it's still a 4/4. At number 5, it's Fanatical Fever. For 2 generic and 2 green, it's an instant that gives a creature +3/+0 and Trample. First of all, this isn't a great buff in general. This is because good combat tricks are capable of helping your creature survive combat, not just pushing damage through. This is because if you use this for damage, you're 2-for-1ing yourself since you lose your attacker and this card, and because this doesn't offer a toughness boost, it isn't likely to help a creature survive combat any better than it could before. So if this just allows you to do more damage, which is the usual use case, you're 2-for-1ing yourself since you lose your attacker and the card, and your opponent just loses their blocker. That's going to lose you the game 9 times out of 10. So that kind of boost makes it tough for this to be a great trick to begin with, but that's especially true when you're spending 4 mana. That also means you're likely taking a huge tempo hit when you use it. And sure, if you do have a creature that's already massive, you can use this to trample over a Saproling token or something, but that's the card's ceiling, effectively making it a super situational burn spell of sorts, and that's just not a card you should be playing. It's pretty funny to compare Fanatical Fever to Giant Growth. You spend 1/4 of the mana and you don't get Trample, but you also get +3 Toughness, which is so much better. At number 4, it's Elder Landworm. For 4 generic and 3 white mana, it's a 5/5 with Defender and Trample, and when it blocks, it loses Defender. So yeah, this creature is bad. This makes the other creatures on this list look incredible. Even if it never had Defender, it would be a terrible card since it's a 7 mana 5/5 Trampler, and it's not even an easy 7 mana, since it requires 3 white. With Defender, that means its Trample upside is entirely useless up until the point where it blocks something, and it's far from guaranteed to even survive a block, since other 7 mana creatures are likely to be far more formidable than it is. I mean, look, if your opponent doesn't have any creatures, this is still bad because it's not doing anything, and if they do have creatures for you to block, they don't even have to attack into it until they either have a good attacker that can take down the worm or just swing for lethal, and there's not much you can do about any of that in the meantime. Basically, Elder Landworm is bad no matter what the state of the game is. So you might be asking, how are there 3 Trample cards even worse than this? Well, unlike the remaining 3 cards on the list, Elder Landworm at least adds to the board up front, not something that can be said for the remaining cards, like for example, the number 3 card, which is Xanthic Statue. It's an 8 mana artifact, and it doesn't do anything at all until you sink 5 mana into it, at which point it does become a formidable 8/8 Trampler until end of turn. So while it can eventually be more imposing than Elder Landworm, it takes a 13 mana investment to get there. And even once you have sunk that mana into it, it's not like it becomes an 8/8 Trampler for good either. You have to spend 5 more mana on it each and every turn you want it to be a card that actually does something, and that's what makes it even worse than the Landworm. The Landworm might have meager stats for the cost, but at least it's always a creature, even if it does have Defender. So now you're probably asking, what's even worse than Xanthic Statue? The answer is the number 2 card, which is War Chariot. For 3 generic mana, it's an artifact, and you can pay 3 generic and tap it to give a creature Trample until end of turn. Yeah, so War Chariot does stone nothing on its own, and then it has some similar problems to the statue. You have to sink lots of mana into it for it to keep doing stuff, and the thing it does requires you to have a creature, and as good as Trample can be, you already need a creature to be pretty good, or at least large, for Trample to even be relevant. So yeah, it takes 6 total mana to do something, and the thing it does is incredibly weak for the cost, but there's still one Trample card that's even worse. And that card is Barreling Attack. For 2 generic and 2 red, it's an instant that gives a creature Trample until end of turn, and it gives a creature +1/+1 for each creature that blocks it. So you spend 4 mana and a whole card to give something +1/+1 and Trample, and most of the time that's all it's going to do. For an instant that gives something Trample to even be worth looking at, it needs to offer a reasonable stats boost too. I mean, we saw Fanatical Fever earlier on the list, which itself is an awful Trample combat trick for reasons I've already discussed, but at least it gives a significant power boost that can have an effect on how much damage your opponent takes. Not Barreling Attack, at least not usually. And amusingly enough, even if you do get more of a boost out of the attack by using something like Lure to force a bunch of blocks, +1/+1 per blocker is unlikely to help your creature survive combat any better than it could before, because it's likely that each creature that's blocking it is at least a 1/1. So Barreling Attack is bad in a vacuum, and it's even bad in the ideal situation. And while War Chariot's pretty darn bad too, at least it gives you a repeatable way to give stuff Trample, unlike the attack which has a meager effect and only does it a single time. That's what makes Barreling Attack the worst Trample card in the history of Magic. Those are my picks for the 10 worst trample cards in Magic. If you want to prove me wrong, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the over 750 MTG top 10s I've already made, including many more on the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.